Hello everyone and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk Omnichannel Payment Configuration. My name is Evan and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the event, and we will have some time at the end to speak to some questions verbally. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Ruben Delgado, Senior Program Manager. Ruben, over to you.
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. As mentioned, I'm Ruben Delgado, Program Manager on the product team, and I focus on payments. And today I'm here to talk about omnichannel payment configuration. So Rob Bertram, a senior solution architect, will be helping moderate the questions as I'm talking. So appreciate Rob for joining me here. Let's go ahead and get started. So our agenda for today, we'll start with a really quick intro, and then we'll talk about key features specifically for omnichannel payments, and then some other key features we've built for payments recently. And then we'll move into a discussion about out-of-box connectors, and then some tips and tricks. And next, we'll have upcoming features. So from an intro standpoint, there's not a lot. I'll start with our mission. This is important to go over. From a payments team standpoint, it's good for us to always keep this in mind. So I want to share with you what we want to keep top of mind. So the goal of the Microsoft 365 Commerce Payments team is to support merchants who want to provide seamless, natural, and innovative payment options. This includes providing rich out-of-box capabilities and an extensive, well-documented SDK to help integrators deliver differentiated experiences that are as unique as the merchants they support. So some key things here, aside from the fact that that should say Microsoft Dynamics 365 Commerce. I want to emphasize seamless, natural, and innovative payment options. So we're always trying to remove friction from the customer's experience, and payments is traditionally a place where there's plenty of friction to be found. But we found that if we treat the customer like our channel, and which is kind of becoming a common mantra for our team, if we treat the customer like our channel, that means we need to be able to let them conduct their transactions wherever and however they want, and that includes paying. Also with COVID in the last year, we've seen that a lot of sort of e-commerce, traditional e-commerce type payment methods are bleeding into the physical space. So we want to keep that in mind. And if it's natural to pay with a certain payment method online and customers want to do it in the store, it's our goal to support that. So I also mentioned we want to provide rich out-of-box capabilities, but also we need to have good extensibility story that's provided through a well-documented SDK. And this is something we're always striving toward. We've made good progress in the last few years, but we've got a ways to go. So we call this out partly because we're sort of proud of the documentation we put out there, but also we know we always need to be improving. So this intro is brief because there's a whole tech talk that should probably serve as an intro. If you're not familiar with the product, you'll want to watch the Omnichannel Orders Tech Talk and the Omnichannel Payments Tech Talks. This Tech Talk is a follow-up to the Omnichannel Payments, the first one. And that one was sort of an overview to get you familiar with our different components in the system and what we support out of box. And so we sort of jump from 100 level to 300 level discussion around very specific capabilities, configurations, and tips and tricks. So please take time after this. If you haven't seen those tech talks, give those a watch, and then maybe this will make more sense. So key features. There are two primary features for omnichannel. There's omnichannel payments. That's sort of like the first omnichannel payments feature, and then omnichannel commerce order payments. So as I speak about each of these features, I just put the links here at the very top, so you can go check out documentation on your own. In a few cases, there isn't documentation, but it's covered elsewhere. But the omnichannel payments feature, that was maybe 2.5 years ago, we shipped this feature, and it was sort of our first foray into true omnichannel payments. And it added support for things like buy in call center or online and pick up in store. It also introduced, as part of that buy online, pick up in store, it introduced the ability to take a payment from one channel and use it in a different channel, like when I capture a payment. So that means that you need to have the same payment connectors in all of your different channels, and we actually will use those to perform order operations against these payments. So this first feature, it added support for linked refund, buy online, pick up in store, buy in call center, pick up in store, buy in store A, pick up in store B, and buy in store A, ship to customer. So it was a pretty good chunk of functionality we laid down a while back, but we weren't finished. So last summer, in the summer of 2020, we shipped omnichannel commerce order payments. I often abbreviate it when I'm writing to OCCOP. I decided to do that after I wrote omnichannel commerce order payments a few hundred times and realized there needs to be an easier way to do that. But what this does is it rationalizes payments across all of our channels. I'll explain what that means in more detail later. It also enables editing of payments for orders created in different channels. So the primary place where we're editing those orders and where a lot of that emphasis is in the back office. So when this feature is enabled, your users need to be call center users to have those rich payment capabilities, payment editing capabilities in the back office. Also, when this feature is enabled, you should have disabled pay later, the pay later option in the point of sale. So what this means is in the point of sale, when you're creating a customer order, there's an option to pay later or capture a credit card for fulfillment, basically. Pay later, what that can do is if you create an order in the point of sale and then it needs to be recalled in the call center and call center has order completion enabled, the call center person won't be able to submit that order unless they get a payment. So we want to make sure there's a payment captured up front for all of our orders. With our recent movement into B2B, like in storefront, for example, we're getting a lot more emphasis on account. So in the future, you might see an on account option here. So when you're creating a customer order in the point of sale, you might have options to pay on account or collect a credit card for fulfillment and not be allowed to pay later. So moving forward into set up sort of a key point of this feature is that we needed to rationalize payments between all our channels. And one good way to do that and to make sure that we can have consistent business logic for all of our channels is to map payments to operations. So this used to say pause operations, but we made it more generic because now even in your call center and in your e-commerce, you need to have these mapped to operations so we can know how to handle those payments when they're used in a different channel. And this is checked as part of our prerequisite check when you try to enable the feature. If you've enabled this feature with our old demo data, you see that there's over a dozen warnings that these operations aren't done correctly. That's since been fixed in demo data, but on older versions, you might see that. So this feature has several prerequisite features. These features should probably be enabled anyway. They're sort of best practices, but they allow us to make sure that omnichannel commerce order payments can function properly. So I need to apologize. I added a border to my screenshots here and realized just before the call that it cut off some of the text. So sorry if that's distracting. Anyway, our prerequisite features, there's unified payment posting journal defaults for commerce, omnichannel payments, which we just talked about, duplicate payment protection on invoicing, and enable refunds over multiple captures. So when you try to enable this feature, if those features aren't enabled, you won't be able to. So you need to enable these features before you can turn this one on. And you could potentially turn those off later, but you shouldn't. So we recommend you just keep those all turned on. I think omnichannel payments is the only one that you actually cannot turn off later on. Okay, and I'll take a moment to mention there's a ton of content here. I think I have 70 slides to cover in an hour. So I'm trying to provide a lot of good information here, and I'll be moving pretty fast. The intent is that this can be watched later. The slide deck will be provided as a PDF, so you can always reference this later. So I'm taking an opportunity to kind of have you drink from the fire hose and get as much good info as possible. So other key changes, we added a payments type field to order headers. So you see in your order headers, this is a new field, and when this feature is enabled, you'll be able to understand when you're looking at an order where that order was created. So if the payments type says commerce, that means the order was generated in e-com or the point of sale. If it says call center, that means the order was generated in call center. And legacy means that either the order was generated by a person using base AR sales orders, or the order was created before the feature was enabled. A key point on that is if you enable this feature and then create an e-commerce order and then disable this feature, you wouldn't be able to fulfill that e-commerce order, for example, until you turn that feature back on. So just something to keep in mind. If once you turn the feature on, any orders processed or created after that time, you won't be able to process if you turn the feature back off. So another key change, we enable order completion for your call centers, and we actually hide that configuration option for your call centers when this feature is enabled. So order completion allows us to require that all of our orders have payments, and that just helps later on when we're trying to fulfill those orders in a different channel. And it prevents those orders from sort of going into an abyss where they're fulfilled and they result in a balance on a customer's account where you didn't intend to have that happen. So this is turned on by default. So and another key change here, which you probably noticed if you played around with the feature, is when this feature is enabled, you can click on your payments in call center and see your payments as if the order was generated in call center. If the feature is disabled, the payments button is disabled and you can't manage your payments. So that's a key point there. This is kind of the biggest part of this feature, is that you can click on this and manage payments from call center. So for supported scenarios for commerce order payments, this is all in the documentation. I added it in here, the slide deck, just so you could have it and quickly and easily reference what's supported with this feature enabled. I won't go through all of these, but you can see there's an explanation for scenarios supported for editing orders, canceling orders, and what happens if you have partially and fully captured card payments, what you can do. And then removing order payments, what happens if you need to remove a payment. Depending on the state of the payment, we have the description of sort of what you're able to do there. And finally, canceling an order. And what happens if you need to cancel an order and these payments have been, either not captured or partially captured or fully captured. So come back in your own time or check the online docs and you can see more about that. So some more key features around payments that aren't necessarily just focused on omnichannel commerce orders, but they're important features that people need to know about, and I'll talk about sort of some good things to know for each of these. So we've got enabling advanced external gift card, purchasing gift card on e-commerce. That's a newer feature. Unified payment posting, skip change due, dialog box and point of sale, require card for point of sale orders, wallet payment support, archive credit card transaction data, and process cards without a hardware station. So first, Enabling advanced external gift card. This is, we added the capability of processing external gift cards through the call center and e-commerce. And out of the box, we support SVS and GiveX gift card providers through our add-in connector. So this adds support for basically, we have a single dialog box, which you'll see later. And when you enter your gift card number, we use a method called resolve card types to figure out who the provider is and which connector to use for that gift card. So it's well documented with the link above, but a few things to mention. Virtual gift cards can only be issued for SVS at this time. So if you think about, I want to email a gift card, when we implemented this feature, SVS had support for virtual gift cards through add-in, but GiveX did not. Now GiveX is supported, so we'll look at implementing that in the future. Another thing is if you're issuing physical gift cards, so you have a gift card that will be mailed to somebody, except for in PAWS, you have to go to the gift card provider's portal and activate the gift card. And then if you think about in a back office scenario or a DC scenario, someone's performing the packing of a box, they would need to take the physical gift card, activate it, and then you can add that gift card number to the order line. It will be saved with the order line, and then you drop the gift card in the box and ship it to the customer. So in the point of sale, we can activate those gift cards programmatically, but in the back office, typically it's done through a portal, or a lot of our merchants will, if a gift card needs to be shipped, they'll have the gift card provider do that, and they just outsource that entirely. For purchasing gift cards on e-commerce, again, there's documentation there. This adds support for issuing those cards as part of your e-commerce shopping experience. So when you add this gift card, the cart will collect recipient details, a message, happy birthday or whatever. And then that gift card will be issued during invoicing in the back office. So this only supports virtual gift cards right now. Through the add-in connector out of box, we have partners who are implementing this for other third-party gift card providers. But today, just remember, if you want to issue a virtual gift card through our storefront, you need to use SVS. So unified payment posting, what this does is it adds consistent selection of payment journals for payments and refunds in your channels. So before, I think this journal was only used for call center, and the refunds journal, you could select one, but it would just pick the first one alphabetically or something like that. So it didn't really make sense before. Now we can have the ability to make sure that you have used the same journals for payments and refunds across all your channels within an LE. Skip change due dialog box in the point of sale. People who've worked with the product for a long time have probably wondered, why do I have to click OK on the change due box when there's no change due? Most transactions these days are for exact amount using a credit card or debit card. So having that extra step for every transaction really adds up. For some of our larger customers, it's they've done the numbers on just not having to click OK on that change due dialog box. And it leads up to, it's like thousands of hours per year. So this is a small feature, but it's a huge impact. So it's good we don't have to, we can turn that off. There's one caveat. If you have as required set up for your gift card printing, then we'll ignore this setting and show the change due. And that's because if you have your gift card printing set to as required, that gives the store associate the ability to decide if they want to print a gift card or not. That's something they do on the change due dialog. So that's why we ignore this setting if that's set to as required. So I mentioned this before, we have the ability to require a card for point of sale orders. This is sort of separate from omnichannel commerce orders payments. This was a request from merchants who were saying, I don't want to allow pay later when I'm creating a customer order in the point of sale. So we have this ability. Now we're considering adding the ability to specify, as I mentioned, on account or card. when you're creating a customer order, especially with all of the stuff we have going on with B2B today. You'll be seeing probably some more on account focus in the point of sale for certain workflows. So we also recently launched wallet payment support. This was really added for our PayPal connector that shipped in 10.0.14. And what this does is it allows you to not have to set up bin ranges for certain payment methods. And this is, if anyone's ever worked with bin ranges, you know they can be a pain. So this is really exciting. And we, as I mentioned, we added this for PayPal. But when that was shipped in 14, we didn't add support for this in the add-in connector or the point of sale channel. So the utility was sort of limited. And for 10.0.19, we'll be, in my opinion, finishing this feature. So the add-in connector will have this, and you won't need to set up bin ranges. And these payment setup will be honored in the point of sale. So a little bit more about this bin range, if people don't know. Your bin range is your first 6 digits of your credit card number, and that's returned in your authorization response. And we use that to map to card types. I have a little illustration of that later on. But with wallet payments, there isn't a bin range. So we have this key way of us taking an authorization response and mapping it to a card ID, and that's no longer provided by these wallets. So that's what wallet support is all about, is kind of finding a way around that. So what happens is if you have a payment connector and you have specified processor payment methods within the payment connector, when we open this new dialog, we'll check all of your connectors and see which ones have processor payment methods assigned. And any unmapped processor payment methods will populate in this middle column. And then what you can do is select your card tender type. So in this example, I would select PayPal. And I would say I want to map my PayPal card tender type to this processor payment method that can come from my payment connector, and click Add. And that will move this processor payment method into my mapped column. And the idea is, with this UX, we know exactly what payment methods will come in from our payment connectors. We'll be able to make sure that they're all mapped to card tender types in the back office. And this is way easier than setting up bin ranges. So that's what it looks like when you're mapped and ready to go. As I mentioned, this middle column will grow considerably when we add processor payment method support to the add-in connector. Right now it's just supporting PayPal, and in 10.0.19 it will be expanded. Another interesting feature is archiving credit card transaction data. This was added in 10.0.17. I thought the docs would have been published by now, but I couldn't find them, so I'll follow up on that. But there are docs in some state of publishing. And essentially what this does is it's a new job that archives old credit card transaction data to Azure Blob storage. So as you may know, credit card transaction data can, the XML blob that's returned with these authorization responses, it can be a pretty good size, and it adds up over time. And in addition to that, we have people who build their own connectors will add extra parameters or save extra data with this blob. So it can get up to like 40 KB per authorization response. So over millions of transactions, that starts taking up a lot of space in your database. And we get an alert when your database size is over 40% of the allowed, or excuse me, over 70% of the allowed capacity. And those alerts also tell us where the tables that are growing the fastest. And it's often it's this retail transaction table where those XML details are stored for your auth response. So we added this ability to archive that data and keep your headquarters DB slimmer. And here's what it looks like. So here's your job, and you can specify your minimum transaction age and days. And the main consideration here is you want to think about how long do we support linked refunds? Because once this data has been archived, link refunds will fail. And so you shouldn't set this minimum transaction age in days for shorter than you allow linked refunds. So once you do this, you click next, and we give you a preview of the data that you'll be exporting. And from here, you can export this data to Excel if you want. This has paging, so we're not going to list. If it's 1 million transactions, we won't list it here. But if you export to Excel, you can see all of the data. So once you click OK, we give you a warning that this is this data is archived, it's not easy to retrieve. If you want to move forward. And if you click yes, then the job will start. And the first time you run the job, it's single threaded. So it could take up to a couple days if there's a lot of, millions of transactions that need to be archived. So if the job does take a day and there's a lot of transactions, let's not file an ICM. Let's just let the job finish and let all of that data archive. We also have support for processing credit cards without a hardware station. This was something that was done in direct response to curbside pickup scenarios that people became very popular last summer. So what this does is it makes all card not present requests go through the commerce scale unit or retail server. And if you think about our clients that we have CloudPOS and the iOS point of sale client. Those don't have a built-in hardware station. So if you want to use those for curbside pickup scenarios, previously you would have to deploy a shared hardware station, which obviously isn't ideal if you want to really roll out curbside pickup quickly. And so we introduced this parameter to enable that specific scenario where a customer makes a purchase online. They provide their payment details at that point. Then they go to a store and they just need to pick up their goods. And the store associate performs the pickup in the point of sale. They don't need to accept a card or anything like that because it's on file. So this allows you to take a CloudPOS and start doing curbside pickup immediately. And you could do it on any device, no installs required, no hardware stations required, no physical payment terminals required. So it's a pretty cool feature. One thing to mention is that it's not supported for offline. If all of these calls need to go through the retail server, all these card not present calls, and you're offline, then you're not able to process transactions. So if support offline is set to yes for your register, then we'll throw an error if you try to select a card not present processing through retail server. So we've fixed, in the past, we've kind of fixed some bugs and used features to prevent those bugs from being sort of fixed for everyone by default. And a lot of the reason for this is that there's a fair amount of customization in some of these flows, and we didn't want to break anyone who's in prod. So traditionally these might be considered hot fixes, something that we would hot fix. We have these hidden behind feature flags, and everyone should enable these because they really make things work better. But we just didn't want to enable these and cause problems where there might be extensions. So the first one, duplicate payment protection on invoicing, pretty much exactly like it says. We added a little bit of better logic to make sure that if there's a problem when you're invoicing in the back office, that we don't try and create another payment capture. Then there's manual void of expired credit card payment lines when authorizations are expired. That's the actual feature name. And again, it's pretty explanatory. If there were flows, and I think we kind of have other features that have come later that have made this a little bit better. But if your credit card authorization was expired and we couldn't get a new one, then previously you couldn't remove that payment line from your order. And we basically just allow that when this feature is enabled. I'll talk more about some improvements around expiration later on. Another one, enabling refunds over multiple captures. So let's say I have an order for $1,000 and I fulfill it in a $500 shipment that I capture, and then I fulfill a $50 shipment, capture that payment, and then make another shipment for $250. Previously, this was a long time ago, if you returned the first order, we would be able to refund and everything was fine. But if you return the second invoice rather, there was some lack of logic figuring out how much was still refundable for your card transactions on that order. So this feature turns on that logic, makes it work a lot better. Then there's an enhanced handling of secondary authorizations. And if you think about that same scenario where I ship $500 worth of goods, I invoice $500, capturing that payment, then what we do is we go get a new authorization for the remaining $500 balance on the order. Now, with this feature enabled, what happens is if the subsequent authorization for the remaining $500 fails, then we change the tender line amount on this order to equal the amount that was captured. And what this does is it should cause your orders to go to the out of balance workbench. So this depends on your overpayment and underpayment settings in call center, but the idea is this order would sort of come out of the flow for fulfillment. It would be on the out of balance workbench, and a user would have to contact the customer to get a payment for the balance due on that order. So let's talk about out-of-box connectors. This isn't going to be a list of everything that's supported for our out-of-box connectors. This is more sort of tips and tricks. So for our Adyen out-of-box payment connector, Adyen requires that you get payment terminals from Adyen. So this comes up frequently, and some people are sort of confused. And what happens is these payment terminals, the payment processors can be pretty concerned about the pedigree of the payment terminals. So if we have merchants who go to Adyen and say, hey, I have these devices, can you just load software on them? It can affect the experience overall, because first of all, there's a lot of work involved in reformatting these devices and reloading the software. Second of all, as I mentioned, there's sort of a lack of knowledge about the chain of custody for those devices before they went to have software loaded on them. So I'll just let you know up front, if you choose Adyen, they'll require that you use their devices. If the cost is a problem for using their devices, talk to Adyen about that, but you can expect to have a hardware refresh. So also, I've updated the docs to describe setup for cloud terminal architecture. This has been a frequent request. Essentially what that means is we can communicate with these devices over a local network, or we can communicate with them through Adyen's cloud. So we've always had the local network side of things documented, but the cloud side of things we haven't documented. So some key things to keep in mind if you want to use the cloud terminal architecture is that you need to have a good internet connection, because you're communicating with this device through the internet. I think that's the primary thing. So some good things about it are that you don't have to be on the same local network. So for mobile scenarios, this can make things a little bit easier. Although Adyen just told me today that they've added, in a newer firmware version, they've added the ability to pair your payment device with like a phone using Bluetooth. So that's a new thing. I probably shouldn't be mentioning that, but actually it'll be coming out in their new firmware versions. So you'll hear about that in the next probably few days. Anyway, so that's cloud setup. Some downsides of cloud are there's no offline, obviously, because if you can't communicate with the internet, you can't communicate with your device. So if you have a local network and not a very good internet connection in your store, you should probably just use the local API, which has been documented forever. Okay, so more about Adyen. By now, everyone should be using V2 of the Adyen connector. V2 support provides better support for strong customer authentication, which is required in Europe. And it also, V2 includes a call center fix that applies to the US. So if you have e-commerce or call center, you should be using V2. For e-commerce, what's important, even if you're in the US and you don't think you're subject to these EU requirements around strong customer authentication, it's up to the issuing banks to exempt US merchants from those requirements. So what will happen is if you make an authorization request for a cardholder whose bank was issued by some European bank that doesn't acknowledge the US exemption, then you might get a redirect. And what that means is for for banking in Europe, we need to be able to authenticate that cardholder and have their actual bank that issued the card authenticate that user. So in an e-commerce flow, the customer enters their credit card number, clicks OK, and if strong customer authentication is required, a pop-up comes up from their bank, asks them to log in or verify who they are, and then assuming that's successful, the customer is redirected back to checkout and complete that flow. So if you're using V1 of the Adyen connector, and for some reason you get challenged or your customer gets a SCA challenge in an online checkout, that will get a soft decline, and we don't want that to happen, so please switch to V2. Also in the US, what happens is for call center requests for V1, when those are sent to Adyen, they're sent as e-commerce. So Adyen doesn't know the difference, so they might launch strong customer authentication, and for a call center user, that will just break. They can't authenticate the cardholder as the call center user. So, and I think most of our merchants are using V2 by now. So it's just something to call out, and we're adding validation to set up to make sure that people are using V2. We're very strongly warned that V2 is required. So if you're setting up switching from V1 to V2, there's one thing you need to know, just an additional property that needs to be added to your merchant properties. And if you've set up Adyen, then you know what your cloud API key is. And so what you need to do if you set up V2 is navigate to API credentials, select the WS user for whom you're using their cloud API key in your current setup. And then for that same user, you need to paste in your call center URL or your AOS URL and click, sorry, this is the first step. You paste in your call center URL, click add origin. And then once that origin's added, you can generate an origin key for that URL. So you paste the same URL in here, click generate origin key, and you'll get a key down here that you can copy. So you need to do this for e-commerce and for call center. So Adyen has a newer way where you don't have to have these specific origin keys for each URL. We haven't uptaken that yet. So for the time being, if you change the URL, you need a new origin key. And once you get that origin key, you paste it here in your merchant properties and you're good to go. Another thing I'll mention right now, since we're talking about it, and it kind of goes hand in hand with this, is if you have storefront, your merchant properties are cached on the Commerce Scale Unit. And to get those merchant properties to update, you should run the 1070 job, the channel configuration job. And what that will do is it won't actually update any data in your channel database if you've only changed merchant properties because they're not stored there, but it will update the checksum. So, and that will cause the cache to be refreshed. So we just had a case exactly like this, where the origin key was updated and the changes didn't take effect until they ran the 1070 job. So more about Adyen. Gift card providers are case sensitive. So this is in documentation, but it bears repeating. SVS and GiveX need to be all lowercase. Also, don't enable CVV here. This is the sort of AX, or excuse me, AX, the commerce back office CVV fields that are in the payment services setup. And part of the problem is if you turn these on, we'll use a form from the back office to try and prompt for CVV. And we don't want CVV anywhere near our software or our back office. So that should always be collected by the payment processor in an iframe. And so that's the reason we don't support this setting. One of the reasons is that we let the processor figure out if the CVV is needed or not. In Adyen's case, the CVV will prompt it at the time of tokenization. Another key here is we've got two different expirations. One is in the Adyen connector, and one is in accounts receivable parameters. And the main thing you need to take away is that this authorization stale period should be set for a greater period than your authorization expiration period in accounts receivable. Because what will happen is this is primarily meant for point of sale. So let's say you're picking up an order in point of sale. We need to capture a payment for that order. That capture request is asynchronous with Adyen. So the stale period was introduced so that capture request would fail rather than let an obviously expired authorization call go out and the customer walks out with the goods. So this property was added, but it's not, the implementation could be a little bit better because it just sort of fails. The accounts receivable parameter is better because it will actually go get a new authorization when authorizations become expired. And if you have these values flipped, then it's not great. So just keep in mind that this value needs to be greater than this value. So another thing, optional domain. This is a property that's required when you go live. So the main point here is that the label is bad because it's not optional at all. It's required for live, and this is documented, but we will see people try to go live and optional domain continues to come up. So as I mentioned, we have a PR for validating your setup when you're setting up version 2. And we also, as part of that validation, we check to make sure that if your gateway environment is set to live or custom, that we're checking to make sure the optional domain is added here. Because that's something that, since it's not required until you go live, it's often something that people find out about last minute or realize last minute. So another thing about the Adyen payment connector, this comes up quite often. I haven't documented this yet, but it does work for base AR sales orders without any retail scenarios at all. So you can create an order in an AR sales order and specify a card payment and use all of that sort of core AR functionality. And that works well with the Adyen connector. So I've tested specifying the payment for the order, checked the authorization, checked the capture upon invoicing, refund flows. Those are all working well. We have customers using those in prod today. One thing I'll mention is that when you're settling open AR balances on for customers, you need to be a back office call center user. So whoever's performing that that settlement needs to be a call center user to be able to select a credit card. So one thing to keep in mind. So as I mentioned, I need to create docs for this. There's a plethora of docs for base AR payment services setup, but I'll come up with one that's more succinct and specifically targeted for using this connector for AR scenarios. So PayPal, as I mentioned, it just came out in 10.0.14, so there's not a lot of tips and tricks yet, but I will mention that PayPal Express is something that's under consideration. So today it's the traditional PayPal experience where you select your payment and click continue, and it's mostly just the payment. PayPal Express is where PayPal handles a lot more of the checkout experience and also billing agreements. So we don't have support for things like card on file where a customer has made a purchase and then they call in the call center and want to make a new order, and you select their card on file or their card token and create a new order. That's not supported today, but PayPal does have a new billing agreement architecture that looks like it will work pretty well for us. So we'll probably add support for that in the future. That's a the monthly update when that would come out. That's not scheduled right now. Quick note about the test connector. This is for sandbox and dev only. It must not be used for UAT testing, must not be used in prod. It's not supported like other commerce features or components that are intended for prod. So we have people who are using this for UAT, or they use the test connector in some form in prod, and it's very much not supported. So just last night we had a Sev2 ICM where someone was trying to use the test connector in prod. So I understand where you don't have, there's not an out-of-box payment connector in some of these locales, that the test connector feels like a good option. And I understand that would be tough, right? So we're looking at other options there, but for now, just please don't use the test connector for UAT or prod. So some quick tips and tricks for back office. Bin ranges are sort of a traditional problem. Basically, our bin range is, as I mentioned, it's the first 6 digits in our auth response, the first 6 digits of the card. And when we look at that bin range in an auth response, we try to find a matching card ID. So in this example, you can see Visa I have set up. So Visa credit cards are better examples, master. So if I get an authorization response and it starts with 5, then I know that that authorization response is a MasterCard. If I get a different authorization response that starts with 5, anything from 50 to 59, and it's of type debit, then I'll look for a debit card ID that has that bin range. So you have to have a credit bin range and a debit bin range for things like master credit and master debit. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, your gift cards need to have bin ranges for e-commerce. So don't copy this bin range because it's sort of fictitious. But the key is that everything needs to map to a bin range if you're getting an authorization response. Some merchants try to get really granular with this and realize there are hundreds of bin ranges, and that would be a lot of work. So they'll end up keeping it more generic. When we have wallet support, this will be a thing of the past. It will go the way of horse and buggy, which I can't wait for. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Make sure you have bin ranges. Make sure you have one for credit and one for debit. In back office, another thing is that our default online customer, we save credit card tokens for all of our default online customers to that same record. And a lot of merchants don't want that to be selectable in the call center. So here's a little sample for how you can prevent that dropdown from being populated in order completion. This would need to be cleaned up before you released it to prod and should be tested accordingly in UAT. But this is just a little sample that we came up with to help people work around that rather than deleting all of the card tokens, which has happened a few times, and that can cause problems later on for fulfillment. We shouldn't have a dependency on those card tokens for fulfillment, but we do. And this is kind of a quick way to prevent those tokens from being used for orders that don't belong to that customer. So for storefront, always make sure your SSK is up to date. Resolve card types, as I mentioned, when you enter a gift card, we have one field where you enter a gift card number, and then we go look and figure out what gift card that has, what the gift card that's mapped to from a tender ID. And also we use that to figure out which connector to use for that gift card. So the key takeaway is just make sure that you have bin ranges for all of your gift cards. And I mentioned the merchant properties caching. So also in e-commerce, if you set up payments and you're getting some sort of security error, make sure that your URLs are listed for your payment connectors, and then you should be able to make that call. If you're trying to add digital gift cards and in the SSK, it doesn't look like you expect to see or like you see in the documentation, that's a good time to update your SSK. For e-commerce, if you don't specify a supported tender type for fragment for payments, then what we do is we just grab the first payment connector we find that matches your store's currency. Alternatively, like for PayPal here, you see my supported tender type is PayPal. So when we render this checkout UI, we go figure out which connector supports the tender type called PayPal, and that's the payment connector for which we show the payment accepting point. So if your payment module fails to load, check to see if you have KB 4602802. This is a regression that was entered in 10.0.14, and it was caused by the fact that we needed to have support for multiple payment connectors in the checkout. So the solution was to require connectors to have a connector ID. And I apologize for this regression. Wasn't planned to go like that, but if you see your payment module fails to load, it probably could mean that your connector ID isn't assigned. So here are some tips and tricks on payment connectors. Actually, I forgot to mention there's one payments feature that just occurred to me that I didn't discuss. It's tipping support through the SDK. So you can do a search for that and learn about that. It's a cool feature. It just occurred to me that it wasn't listed there. So anyway, tips and tricks for payment connectors. We have a couple interfaces. INamed request handler is used for card present transactions. If you built your own payment connector, you probably know this inside and out, but here's a link to the documentation. And then iPayment processor, same thing. Here's a link to documentation. And this is for all of our card not present scenarios. So that could be e-commerce, call center, or doing things like calling capture for order pickup in the point of sale. The main thing about that is the white paper is old, but it's still relevant. And if you use this documentation actually maps to a white paper. It's a PDF download, but it needs to be updated. It's still relevant, and ignore this white paper for payment terminal integrations. If you're integrating for a payment terminal, you should use the INamed request handler documentation. So as I mentioned, we want to have good docs. That was the first thing I sort of said in this call. This is what I'm talking about, and probably other people had in mind. The white paper needs to be updated, and it's something that's high on our list of priorities. So other best practices for the SDK, and these are sort of verbatim. When I was talking to Martin, one of our more seasoned payments engineers, and so I'm taking notes, and I didn't think I would get to this in the presentation, so they're pretty verbose, but the intention is that someone could go back and look at this later on the PDF, and they wouldn't need a talk track to understand what a lot of this means. So key takeaways: make sure your code's signed, or else your connector won't show up. Make sure that the assembly version doesn't change, so it will be backward compatible, and the connector loads every time. Never store PCI data in the payments SDK blobs. We've seen this before where people are trying to store card data in the auth XML response. Big no-no, please don't do that. And try to get away without needing to deploy extra components or drivers for your payment terminals. If you can communicate via network and not have to install those drivers, it'll just make things easier, makes it easier to service, etc. And if you have a processor that wants a sequence number that gets incremented for every request, make sure that there's a way to recover if that sequence number is lost. Like if your machine crashes, you need to have that sequence number. So just have a strategy for how you handle that. If you're storing it in a registry, make sure that there's some other place where you can have the seed for that sequence number if it's lost for some reason. So the payments SDK blob is your way of storing whatever details are required by your payment processor. If you think about it, we have a set of certain properties that are required by our payments SDK, but your processor might have some other properties like state of the payment, or some things that aren't part of our payments SDK or aren't covered in our white paper. Store those things in the blob, and just keep in mind that that's how you can take properties that are required from a dynamics side and sort of translate them to what's required for your payments processor. More best practices: your service ID needs to be different for each channel. So if you look at the back office setup in payment services, anytime you add a new connector, a service ID will be populated. And we've had some people try and force the same service ID for all of their different channels. That doesn't end well, because that service ID helps us know where that token came from. Your credit card token is locked to the channel where it was created. So if you create a token in e-commerce as part of checkout, and you want to use that to create a new order in call center, then you should make sure that your processor supports that, and definitely test that. Also, make sure your payment device connector response can be used by your processor connector. So if you think about, I create a customer order in the point of sale, I tokenize a card using a physical payment terminal. I take that card token and then use card not present to go generate an authorization for that payment. I want to make sure that whatever comes back from my payment terminal can be used for card not present flows for my processor. In some cases, that's it will take some extra work to make sure that that token can be understood through card not present APIs. And then also ensure that your tokens, actually I just said that. Okay. Upcoming features. So incremental capture supports shipping in 10.0.18. Super excited for this feature. It means if you fulfill an order with multiple invoices, we'll only require one authorization for that entire order instead of getting a new authorization anytime the balance due is decremented. So this will be like a dream come true. It means fewer auths for our merchants, so lower costs. It means fewer declines because we only need one auth and the auths never overlap. It means better customer service because customers won't be confused why you have a bunch of authorizations for a single order. So this will be great. It will require uptake for payment connectors that are out there, but it will be supported with the add-in connector out of box. So keep an eye out for that. It'll also be supported by the PayPal connector, excuse me. So wallet support for add-in in stores, as I mentioned this already, we'll just be extending wallet support to the add-in connector. We're refactoring checkout for payments in e-commerce. So today in e-commerce, we make two requests. One is to tokenize the card details. The other is to get an authorization using that payment token. And we're refactoring that so it's a single request. And that just means better 3DS support. So the liability shift will be very apparent to the merchants to see that yes, 3DS was used. And a lot of processors require this to be done in a single call. So that's coming out in 10.0.19. Google Pay and Apple Pay support through add-in, that's shipping very soon. We don't have a monthly update specified yet, but this is our sort of top next priority from a feature standpoint. So with that, we've got a few minutes left. We'll see if there are any questions here. I'll leave up this additional resources slide so you can see upcoming tech talks, some of really cool talks around architecture and order management flows. This is the part one of this omnichannel payments presentation, and then some relevant articles related to what we've discussed today. So with that, Rob, is there anything in Q&A?
We do. We have three questions for you. The first one is around on-account payment. Can you talk a little bit about how that's coming to e-commerce B2B?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've had the B2B tech talk sessions yet, but I know in 10.0.17, B2B has been, it's out now. I think it was in private preview before, but there should be a lot of documentation around that. I know you can pay on account in e-commerce. I'm actually not the B2B PM, but I'm familiar with what they did there. So you can pay on account and you can go find invoices for your account and pay those as well through the B2B. So I'll try and find some details and actually just do a search. I'm pretty sure all the docs are out there. So check on docs.microsoft.com.
So we are all really excited about wallet services. I think everyone wants to include Apple Pay, Google Wallet, Alipay in their payment flows. How does the roadmap look for card-present solutions?
So little known fact, but you can accept Alipay and WeChat Pay today through the add-in connector. It's not officially supported because, as you know, we need bin ranges to map those auth responses to card types. But for those particular payment methods, add-in will give a bin range that's a 6-digit string of zeros. And so then you just create a bin range of 6 zeros in the back office and map those payment types. And so that's supported today. When our real wallet feature comes out, we'll have better mainstream support for that. We'll have official support for that, I should say.
Fantastic. And last but not least, can you talk a little bit about how retailers can implement third-party financing? Is there a separate payment framework? Do we have like a white paper? And it behaves a little bit kind of like card not present. How can we implement that as a customization?
Okay. So if you're doing it through a processor, typically that would require a couple extra attributes that you send with that request. So we've been discussing this with add-in recently. I'm not sure about how everyone supports this, but For Adyen, what we would need to do is add support for sending an offer code and specifying the actual third-party financing solution. And so what happens is the customer applies for financing in a separate flow, and then an offer code is generated. And in some cases, they'll actually, write down the third-party financing card number. But when you use that for your payment, you specify the offer code, and that goes back to the third party so they know which offer you signed up for. So that's a little bit newer for us. The first thing we probably do is add support for those attributes through the payment connector, and then document it. But that's a good question, and actually that's coming up quite frequently. So at some point we'll have better documentation around it.
Thank you so much, Ruben. These are great presentation, great questions. I'm going to turn it over, Evan, to you to wrap up.
Awesome, thank you. I have posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. That survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.